Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lincoln University, welcome to Public Innovation. Once again, welcome to Lincoln University. Absolutely great that you guys are here, because it's going to be a really exciting afternoon. But I'm not going to spoil anything, I'm just going to do the housekeeping. My name is Wim de Koning, I am the Director of Public Innovation, and together with my team, we try to facilitate this. For the people that need to use the bathroom, you turn at the back of the room, you turn right, and then after the second door, it is again on your right hand side are the toilets. We are not expecting any fire drills, so if you hear the alarm, it is the real deal. And just follow Haley or Joe, they're in the back of the room, or me to safety, and we will take care of you, we'll promise. There will be refreshments after the event. So please enjoy those, but please make sure that you come home safely as well. So please use those beverages responsibly. With all further ado, I want to introduce the Vice Chancellor of Lincoln University, Professor Grant Edwards, to basically introduce Building Excellence Service.
Thank you. Ena mana, ena reo, ena duafa, tena koutou katoa. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to Whare Wānaka, Aoraki University for the first of the Lincoln University Excellence Series presentations. We're the first of a regular series that we have lined up here at the university. As a specialist university focusing on the land-based industries, the university is distinctive at that amongst New Zealand universities and globally. Leading edge land-based research and education, meaningful industry collaborations and global connections make a significant contribution to the land-based industries. Much of the work we do here addresses the grand challenges facing the land-based industries, and we consistently strive to deliver innovative and practical and sustainable solutions going ahead. I think the Excellence Series, which we are seeking to showcase here, allows us an opportunity to really demonstrate the leadership in various disciplines across the university and extend the reach of our very distinctive and impactful research to a much broader community. It's a great pleasure today to kick off this series with Professor Anita Wreford, who will speak about what climate change means for agriculture in Aotearoa New Zealand. And I'm very much looking forward to this presentation. A little bit about Anita. Anita is a professor in the Agricultural Economics Research Unit, where she completed her PhD in 2007. Since then Anita has worked in several research organisations and policy environments, both in New Zealand and in the United Kingdom, including the international renowned Tyndall Centre and the University of East Anglia. Sorry, at the University of East Anglia. Yeah. And his research is focused on climate change adaptation, and her expertise in this area is reflected in through roles as a leader author on 2 intergovernmental panels on climate change, the IPCC reports, including a special report on climate change and land and the Australasian chapter of IPCC assessment report. Bit of a mouthful, but a very long and impactful report. And it also leads the Deep South National Science Challenge Impacts and Implications Program, shaping adaptation research and investment. And through her career, Anita has worked very closely with policymakers on climate change, both at a national level and local government, conducted work for the EU Commission, the OECD, and in New Zealand, and with New Zealand, Scottish, and UK governments. Okay, significant CV there of achievements. Very much welcome Anita to take the floor and for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Anita Wreford. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to come to this talk this evening. And my youngest son actually said, if you do a bad talk, will they take the professor title off you? So I also thought before we started to clarify the title, which was No Climate, No Food, and my husband didn't really understand what I was getting at with that, so I thought I should just explain that it was kind of building on the groundswell movement's slogan of no farmers, no food, no future. And I thought that if I clarified that no stable climate, because of what I was getting at with the title. So thank you, Grant, for that introduction. As Grant said, I did start my PhD, or I completed my PhD at the AERU in the early 2000s. And there I was working, looking at agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and how they're linked to global trade. So I really there at that stage was looking at the mitigation side of climate change. When I left and went to the UK to do a postdoc, I started looking much more about adaptation, so how we can adapt to the impacts of climate change. I kind of have some economics background, but I hesitate to call myself an economist. So most of my research is really interdisciplinary. So in the talk today, I'm going to try and sort of paint a picture about climate change and agriculture in New Zealand, drawing on my own research, but also, I guess, trying to emphasise the message about why it's important, why we need action, and maybe some reflections on why we haven't had more action in New Zealand in this space. So thinking about groundswell, and I'm sure you're all familiar with their protests driving their tractors to Wellington to protest about a range of things that they see are putting pressure on the farming sector, but it was kind of catalysed, or the final thing was the climate change regulations, or proposed regulations and emissions pricing. So it took me back to the early days when I was at Lincoln doing my PhD, when farmers also drove to Parliament to protest against what they called a fart tax, which wasn't actually a fart tax, just to be clear. It was a proposed levy on producers to put into research to reduce agricultural emissions. And farmers all around the country signed this petition, and it was delivered to the Minister of Agriculture, possibly, or we didn't have a Minister of Climate Change then. But it was delivered by the then President of Federated Farmers, who went on to become Lincoln University's Chancellor, not Vice Chancellor. And he said, farmers will never pay this tax. And I thought, you know, thinking back, this is 20 years ago to this year, what could we have done in that time if somehow farmers could have been brought on the journey more to engage with climate change, see that it's something that really needs to be addressed and that they can be part of the solution. So I'll come back to this at the end, but I just thought it was interesting to reflect on where we've got to, and I guess in the time that I've been at Lincoln and going to come back. So why is climate change such a polarised, or such an important question for New Zealand? I think it's interesting that the groundswell movement actually proposed an alternative, which ironically to me was to develop a short-term research fund, which was what people were protesting against back 20 years ago. But it's clearly agriculture and climate change is a sticking point in New Zealand. Most of you, I'm sure, will be aware that 50% of our emissions come from agriculture in New Zealand, from methane and nitrous oxide. So agriculture has to be part of the solution. If it's not, the other sectors will have to reduce their emissions that much more. It just is so critical. New Zealand's emissions since 1990 have increased 21%, 17% in the agricultural sector. 1990 was the base year for the Kyoto Protocol when that was in place. So we really haven't made much progress in New Zealand in reducing our emissions. The increase in agriculture comes from an 80% increase in the dairy herd and more than 600% increase in fertiliser application during this time. So it's time that I guess we have some action. And you'll be aware that New Zealand has set targets and we've got a Climate Change Act now in place. which is promising. And you'll also be aware of the Paris Agreement. New Zealand signed up to the Paris Agreement, which is a global agreement to limit warming from pre-industrial temperatures to under 2 degrees and ideally under 1.5 degrees. So that's the kind of global commitment that we've signed up to. I'm not going to go into the detail of policy of New Zealand's target, but just to show, and I'm sorry if the people at the back can't see this very well, there's an international organisation that tracks countries' pledges under the Paris Agreement and looks at how likely they are to be enough to be sufficient to keep warming at 2 degrees. And so they've rated New Zealand as highly insufficient. What I think is particularly interesting is that they say that our domestic targets are almost sufficient to keep us below 2 degrees, but our policies and action are highly insufficient. So I guess that's the sense that we probably all have, that yes, it's very well having this climate act and our target is here, but the policies and action that we have in place are only going to take us to here. And in a similar vein, another organisation, the UN, looks every year they publish an emissions gap report, which really looks at the global picture of all the countries who've signed up to the Paris Agreement, what they've pledged to reduce their emissions by, and what kind of temperature that would lead us to reach by the end of the century. And don't worry about all the sort of words. The main points to take are that with current policies, these emissions would go along this trajectory. With the policies that different countries have committed, some are conditional, unconditional, we'd kind of go along here. But if we wanted to keep warming below 2 degrees, we need to drop emissions here right now by this kind of amount and to keep it at 1.5 by this amount. And these reductions are so much huger than what we achieved during, or what happened during the COVID pandemic when people stopped flying. Even that wasn't going to get us on this trajectory. So I guess I'm just putting this up here to emphasise that there is such a long way to go if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So what are these temperature kind of changes and things like that? So Grant mentioned that I was involved in an IPCC special report on climate change and land, which came out in 2019. And one of the things that the IPCC likes to produce are these figures that we call burning embers because of their colour. And the yellow colour, sorry, the key isn't there, is a sort of moderate, low to moderate impact. Red is high and purple is extreme, plotted against temperature increases for a selection of different risks. So we're currently at just over 1 degree above pre-industrial temperatures already. So this is this grey line here. Sorry, if only my hand is steady. And you can see that if we take, for example, tropical crop yield decline, at this kind of temperature, the risks are sort of low to moderate. But as the temperature increases around 2 degrees, they switch to high, and then at higher levels, we go to extreme. This one here is food supply instabilities, and already we're in the red colour, and you can see that happening now. I mean, I know we've got other non-climate related disruptions to the food supply globally, but we are seeing some of the climate related ones contribute to that. So the point of these is to illustrate that every degree of warming matters, and every degree that we can avoid warming will mean that the impacts we face are less extreme. So coming back again to why we need to reduce emissions, every little bit really matters. So what does this mean for New Zealand? I've been involved in the most recent IPCC synthesis report in the Australasia chapter. So part of that was bringing together all the evidence that we have around what we're seeing already and what is likely to happen. So just a few key findings about what is already being observed. So this is from the literature, peer-reviewed literature, that shows the kinds of things that we're experiencing that can be attributed to climate change. And so I'm sure it's probably not a surprise to you, but well, we've had 1.1 degree of warming increase since 1910, sea level rise, changes in rainfall patterns, less snow, and increasing extremes. We don't have, interestingly, on there changes in flooding or increased precipitation, but we've seen what has happened in New Zealand recently, and some of that can be attributed to climate change, so probably that will make its way into the literature for the next cycle. And another kind of synthesis of the projections is what's going to happen in the future. So we can experience more of these kind of trends. I think one thing to pick up on is the changes in rainfall patterns. They won't be uniform across the country. So we might have more rainfall on different coasts and different regions. So the impacts are quite locally specific. I think that's quite important to bear in mind. And a lot of that information within the IPCC comes from this Ministry of the Environment report. So more extremes, changes in seasonality, things like that. I was also involved in the first National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which came out in 2020, I think. So this is part of the Climate Change Act. Now that every 6 years the government has to produce a climate change risk assessment, which identifies the key risks to New Zealand. So I pulled out some of the top 10 that I thought were particularly relevant today. And so one is the risks to the land-based primary sector productivity and output due to almost everything. It was quite hard actually to differentiate, so we sort of lumped everything in, but just acknowledging that this will be a significant risk for the country. But I think just in light of what we've been seeing over recent weeks and months is the risk to government from economic costs associated with lost productivity, disaster relief expenditure. You know, these are the kind of things that we're actually experiencing already, and risks to financial system instability. So that will be repeated every 6 years, and then we have to develop an adaptation plan in response to that. The country, not but again, I guess this is still quite abstract. So I want to drill down a little bit into what it really means for agriculture in New Zealand. And this is a research project that I have that is funded under the Deep South National Science Challenge. And it's got some co-funding from Dairy NZ as well. So we're looking mostly at the dairy sector and really looking from the impacts of climate change in terms of the biophysical impacts through to what these mean for economies and farmers and the social side of climate change, interviewing farmers. So it sort of spans quite a range, and it's got a range of different, some people here in the room are part of the project too. So I'll just share some of the findings from this project, which one of these is looking at the effect of heat stress on milk production. So you can see here that, and these are quite preliminary, so don't go quoting them, but under different climate scenarios, the blue one is a higher emissions scenario, so kind of not the future that we want, whereas the red one is more of a mid-range. We're expect to see changes in milk solid losses, so the higher the line, the worse that is under climate change. In terms of pasture production, which is what we're also looking at, some of the work is looking at changes in pasture growth, but then looking at demand from the animals as well. So you can then identify the deficit and begin to think about how you might adapt and fill the deficit. So we've got mid-century across here, end of century down here. We've got less optimistic and more optimistic. These relate to the models, because there's a range of 6 models that are used to drive these scenarios. And so particularly in the less optimistic figures, we have this big gap here. And that is, where farmers will need to either supplement their feed through concentrates or start growing different types of crops that are better adapted to the future climate. So that's kind of quite biophysical kind of research. We're also, this isn't actually from our project, but we'd like to do something like it. So I'm putting this from another study in, which looks at the effect of drought and climate change on farm profits. And so this is for, this line here is just looking at changes in soil moisture, doesn't have a huge effect, but if you consider all the different climate variables, the total profit for sheep and beef farmers by the end of the century in this study is expected to be 54% lower than it was in the base period. So that's quite a significant drop. Again, this is assuming that farmers won't do anything to adapt, and I'll come on to adaptation very soon. We then also, again, this wasn't in the Deep South project, but we'd like to do something similar. This is another project that John Saunders and Alan and I did for MPI for the SLAMAC Fund, which looked at if New Zealand has a drought, it's quite negative, but because we trade, we export most of our products internationally, that effect is kind of moderated on the global market. And if other countries are also experiencing climate change, which is very likely, this scenario is looking at a global breadbasket failure, which basically is most of the major production regions also experiencing a drought at the same time. This would have a positive effect on New Zealand's producer returns because of the trade price, but it would actually be negative for consumers, and you can see already the distributional impacts of higher food prices are pretty devastating in New Zealand and globally as well. That would be a big problem for food security. But I guess just emphasising that it is important to consider the whole system when we think about impacts. Some other work that I've been involved in, which leads up from the IPCC work, is looking at global food security from the risks to that from climate change. So this was a paper that came out just earlier this year, which is really synthesising what we know about climate change and food security. But also for farmers, although they might receive higher returns, they've had to endure a drought, and that can be quite traumatic. So the higher price might not offset the effect on their wellbeing. And so other research that we're doing in that project is talking to farmers and understanding how they've coped with climate change in the past, or whether it doesn't have to, sometimes it's actually more helpful not to necessarily frame it always as climate change, but just extreme weather and things like that. How they've coped, how they see the future, what they might do, what the barriers are and things like that. So this is another factor that has just come out. Looking at the social side, because at the end of the day, the farmers are the ones who are bearing the brunt of climate change, even though they don't necessarily want to reduce their emissions. But it's a complex relationship between the cause and effect, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. But I guess just to emphasise that impacts are complex, and so most of what I've talked about so far is considering impacts on their own, a drought or pasture growth, but actually in reality they're going to occur at the same time, potentially interact with each other, compound, cascade potentially through the system. So this is a paper I wasn't involved in, but just wanted to highlight that we don't know very much about the interactions between impacts, but I think this is an area that we do need more research because, it's not a neat little system that's got nice boundaries around it, it's messy. And also impacts are uncertain. So this is an area that I'm particularly interested in, is how we make decisions despite uncertainty. So it's a little bit small, but basically this figure here highlights, this is changes in temperature, but we have these different climate scenarios that we talk about and when we're doing climate change research. And they relate to different futures in terms of emissions. So the lower trajectories, if we can keep our emissions low, we'll keep warming levels lower. But unfortunately, we're probably tracking, somewhere up around here. But we don't know which one of these pathways we're on. So that's one source of uncertainty. We then also have uncertainties within our climate models, and then we downscale them for use in regions like New Zealand and within regions, local ones. We then usually look at some kind of impact, whether it's water availability or heat stress or what pasture growth. You know, we're always adding layers of models to this, and then we put an economic model in there as well. And so by the time we start to think about adaptation, we've got this cascading envelope of uncertainty. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that, because often when you talk to people, decision makers, they really want localised information for their area, and we can give it to them, but it has to be, it can sometimes lead to a false sense of precision. And so a lot of the work that I do is really understanding how we can still make decisions and adapt and make ourselves more resilient, but without locking us into one of these future scenarios that might not turn out to be the right one. So using ideas like flexibility, not investing in long-term things unless you absolutely have to, and if you do, allowing pathways to change. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a slide or two. A lot of the approaches that we have for decision making tend to assume that we don't have uncertainty and that we agree on everything. So this figure is from the Special Report on Climate Change and Land, but it just shows different kinds of analysis plotted against the level of uncertainty that we have with the problem, and whether we agree on the science or whether our values agree up here. And then also things like whether we can know everything within the question. So, for example, with climate change, those different scenarios I showed you, some of these approaches need probabilities on futures. And we just can't really provide that. We can't know that. We can make assumptions and we can assume they're the same likelihood, or some might be higher or lower, but we really don't know. So it kind of presents challenges to our traditional ways of analysing problems. And so some of my work is trying to apply some of these, or think about how we could answer some of the questions for adaptation and in a more robust way against uncertainty. So some of the work is really just kind of identifying these different approaches and guiding people into which approach would help for which problem. And then other papers or research projects that I've done have applied some of these approaches to questions of adaptation. And I'm just going to focus on one now, which is the adaptation pathways approach. So this comes from a project that I had a few years ago, led by Nick Henry at Landcare Research. And it's this idea of adaptation pathways. I apologise for those of you at the back who can't see, but the idea is that we can identify a range of adaptation options, and some of them might be quite incremental things that we can do in our daily sort of management, timing, sort of generate win-wins in the current climate, but they're not too radical. But they'll only be effective while the climate is kind of changes moderately. But once the changes become higher or very high, those kind of adaptations won't be effective anymore, and we need to switch to a different one. And so the idea with these pathways is that you identify what you might do now, and you might implement that. But you also think about what you might do in the future, like water storage we've got here, or establish covered production systems. You wouldn't start doing them now because you don't know for sure if you'll need to. But you kind of set things in place so that if you needed to change, you could. So you might set land aside, or you might start saving for something, or you might at a higher scale invest in different breeds that are more resilient to future climates, so that when the time comes, you're able to switch pathways. So this approach was actually developed in the Netherlands for water management, and it's really effective, I think, and they've used it there quite a lot. But when you think about it with agriculture, it's a little more complex because we have a lot of small individual people, and their decisions are dependent probably on different scales. So what an individual farmer does is limited it to some extent in terms of the regional council, regulations, the national level, and things like that. So we're playing around with how to apply it here. And I've got a workshop tomorrow actually with our farm, which is a Lincoln University supported demonstration farm, where we're going to work through this with them. So it's a different way, I guess, of thinking about the future, just allowing flexibility and planning into the process. So although there's quite a lot of adaptation, thinking about adaptation going on, and farmers, I guess in the New Zealand context anyway, farmers are playing around, they're trying different things and they're thinking about what they might need to do. But at a higher level, there is still what we call an adaptation gap, like the emissions gap. So the UN has also assessed the level of adaptation that would be required to avoid some of the worst impacts, and it's really too little and too slow. So some other work that I've done a few years ago for the OECD was identifying barriers to the adoption of climate-friendly practices in agriculture, which was kind of interesting. But I think if we come back to the question of groundswell and why they have so many concerns about climate change and acting on climate change, I feel it maybe comes back to that figure I showed about agreeing on the problem and not agreeing on who's responsible for it. There are kind of questions of fairness, and it's one of these wicked problems that you might have heard people talk about. And I feel that in the 20 years that since the farm tax, there could have been a lot more work sort of put into working with farmers to bring them on board. However, there are other drivers at play. So I'll just spend a little bit of time talking now about these aren't government, or they sort of have become government regulations, but initially the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, some of you will be familiar with, was set up in 2017 by Mark Carney. Well, he was a spearhead of it. He was a governor of the Bank of England. And it's really about requiring companies, banks, financial institutions to identify the risks that they're exposed to and disclose them for their investors. And in New Zealand, we're actually the first country that has enshrined this in law, which is the Financial Sector Climate-Related Disclosure and Other Matters Amendment. Happy title. But it's requiring listed companies and financial institutions to identify and disclose their physical and transition risks. So physical risks are the risks I've been talking about from the impacts of climate change. The transition risks are the risks associated with moving to low carbon economy. And so over the last 18 months or so, we at the AERU and NIWA and Manaki Whenua produced some work for Westpac, where they wanted us to identify, actually to the level of their individual farms, the risk that they are exposed to from the climate. It's not published in that, that was a public-facing report, but there's quite a lot of work behind that. And also the transition risks at a more high level, because for them, if they, well, there's this idea of financed emissions, which these are the indirect emissions that through lending to a farmer or whoever they're lending to, they're then exposed, that presents as a risk to them. So I couldn't find examples from New Zealand, it will come, but in Australia, Rabobank and the National Australia Bank have a target of net zero financed emissions by 2050, and they are 50% of Australia's agri-debt market. So these banks are going to require farmers to reduce their emissions, otherwise they're too much of a risk. And also with the physical risk, I guess one of the hesitancies I had during that project was, if we identify farms that are at risk, you know, what are you going to do to them? But they're really their line at the time, and I feel that is their intention, is to work with those farmers to help them adapt so that they don't, then the bank isn't so exposed. But in the future, you know, this could be used as a lever, I guess. And they do, some of the banks do already offer lower interest rates for particular practices, so I think this is an area to watch. Also, some of the processing and food companies, they also have to identify their value chain emissions that they're called scope 3. And so you can see here that many of them have targets to reduce emissions through their value chain. And some are also committed to increasing plant-based protein, which is possibly a challenge to New Zealand's traditional industries. So these kind of changes, I think, will kick in, and together with emissions pricing, probably put some more pressure on farmers to start thinking about what they can do. I'd just like to, I guess, conclude by reflecting that early action is generally seen as being more cost effective than delaying action until there are no alternatives. So just last week, Deloitte published this report, which showed that early action, and I mean, it's not early if we're doing it now, sorry, but it's already too late. But the type of climate action could add 64 billion to our GDP, whereas delaying it could reduce it by 4.4 billion. And this isn't new, like even a few years ago, Westpac and EY produced a similar kind of report, slightly different numbers, but the idea is the same, that if we start taking action, it'll allow us to transition more gradually, it'll be less painful and less costly. And again, it brings me back to the 20 years since we protested against the Farm Act and what we could have been doing in that time. So just as my final slide, finish with a few messages from IPCC. We have a small window to take effective action. Like, we do still have time, but it is a small and rapidly declining window. And the choices that we make in the next 10 years will actually determine our future on the planet, really. And delays will result in more costly impacts and a greater scale of adjustments. Every decision matters. Thank you.
Really enjoyed that presentation. What we're planning to do is to take a very small number of questions here, and I'm gonna stick to 3 in here. Prior moving to the kitchen area where there's drinks and other activities out there, and we'll continue the dialogue with Anita. So I'm just going to allow around prior to mentioning 3 questions, and I see one here from. So please just if you would state the name.
Right. Okay. So Charles Murfield. A question about the lens we're viewing the impact of climate change on the farm system. I'm worried that averages are the wrong thing. The temperatures increasing in Canterbury makes wheat production impossible. Great, we're switching to maize already and we grow soybeans. To me, the issue with climate change and the impact on the farm system is the extremes. We farm everything from deserts to within the polar circle. That's farmable if it's predictable. If it's not predictable, farmers can't farm to unpredictability. And then, to me, it's the linkages between the systems. Climate change is producing instability in the farm system, but also the political system, the economic system, and the social system. And then we have the other poly-crises coming in as well, biodiversity loss, which are causing instability. And I'm looking at this and kind of going, we have all these complex systems, and they're all increasing instability, which is generating further instability in all the systems at the same time. And I'm kind of going, are we really looking at all of this through the higher level that we really should be?
No, I agree entirely. And I guess I agree about extremes. We also do some work on drought and things like that. I just couldn't show everything here. But the bigger question of these different systems interacting with each other is spot on, but I don't have
Okay.
I'm Dick Lucas, science retired.
My honour supervisor.
You said that last time.
Yeah.
You mentioned quite a lot about water. There's another major input into pastures and crops, and that is nitrogen. And an analysis of what is, for most farmers, their main expense is fertiliser. And I understand the price of urea has recently gone up by 4-fold. And, well, it might be the easiest way to reduce cow numbers because it'll be too expensive to put the jolly stuff on. It's all made from Arab gas, so it should help our relationship. So I suppose my question is, have you considered fertiliser and in particular nitrogen? Because without nitrogen, it's the main nutrient to grow plants, even if it's a vegetable or a grass for the cows.
Well, yes, absolutely, and we have. For example, in that Westpac report, we did some modelling with Filjuno, looking at options to reduce emissions from farms. And so farmers can actually reduce their stocking rate and their nitrogen and still actually increase their profits, but it requires really strong farm management skills. That was one of the key messages we wanted at your cross shaking with me. But I'm just carry on anyway. So there are ways that we can change the system. But I mean, Derek Mooch, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work about legumes.
Exactly what I want.
Something to be on the news that a lot of material that's coming out in the literature and the listener and wherever. They talk about nitrogen, fertiliser and how naughty it is and so on. But no one ever mentions the legume, the natural process by which New Zealand farmers produce an enormous amount of protein up to about 1990. Then they got lazy and they started using nitrogen and forgot about the white clover. I mean, you know, it's not hard.
It's interesting that, like some of those traditional ways of coping, like not only nutrients, but coping with variability and things, we've maybe lost some of those skills.
Yeah.
Because when you talk to farmers, they're like, oh, well, we used to grow turnips or whatever, but now we can irrigate, and so we don't need to. And I think understanding some of that and maybe moving back or incorporating some of those practices again would be helpful.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Elizabeth District Council. We're obviously facing a lot of issues with food security. I want to know specific problems. I want to know what the solutions that we're facing here. See what's happened out more is not a lot of really arable lands and so on and being destroyed, and we know that's not going to be productive for a very long time. We're facing, you know, obviously significant national areas which farmers will want to be converted. So with all that reduction of industry, where are we going to secure and how are we looking at long-term securing that food?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess there are a few things I'm thinking of in that. I mean, maybe some of it is using the land that we have more effectively or appropriately, and understanding how climate change will change the suitability of different regions. So there is research that's gone on through the Land and International Science Challenge that's looking at land use suitability. I think, as you're from Selwyn, we could also talk about, you know, where we're building houses, for example, on prime land. But I think, yeah, a strategic approach across the different areas, so agriculture, but also the other uses of land is important, and thinking in the long term. I mean, maybe it's a broader question as well about